learning station here is we've already started our walkabout, and Tim has given a really good introduction. So I think what I'd like to talk about is what this land was and what it meant to Native Americans. So this walkabout is a sort of a spiritual journey as well. This place was extremely important to Native Americans, and we had the group here with the Tongva Gabrielino were a group of many little tribelets, and one of them was right here, and that's how it got its name, Hahamongna. The chief was Hahamongna, and they lived up here, and in fact all the way up the Arroyo Seco was like a highway for Native Americans. Yangna, which was the original town that grew into the Pueblo of Los Angeles, the reason they placed it there, it was right near where the confluence of where the Arroyo Seco ran into the LA River. And the Arroyo Seco is like the chief tributary of the Los Angeles River. So the Indians in this area, it was the widest area was around Long Beach, and it kind of came up into a wedge here, were a group that had a very highly developed trade economy. They're the only Native Americans who had stone plank canoes, which were really seaworthy, so there was a lot of trading up and down the coast. And they were also an acorn economy. So they had villages that were fairly permanent, but then they would move around like on seasonal acorn hunts. And this place word is that the fattest, sweetest, tastiest acorns were up here. So they would come up here, there was like a village, and then even a little bit further up in Millard would be like an acorn gathering depot. And we'd look around and we see oak trees, but actually there's so many different kinds of oak trees, and each oak variety has different qualities. It can be stored for different times, and so they would come up here for maybe a few months and gather and prepare the acorns for storage. And this would be a big trade item. So the acorns would be up here. We had some Gabrielino who lived down by the coast, some who lived on the islands, and there was a lot of trade back and forth between and among the Gabrielino themselves, and also with other tribes. So, for instance, and the main trade route that was overland, not in the sea, came right up through the Arroyo Seco, through Millard Canyon, over the San Gabriel Mountains, and the trade would be, between different groups, and our tar from the tar pits, which would be directly in Gabrielino territory, has been found as far east as the Mississippi River. So sometimes there's this tendency to think that California Indians were somehow, in some way, less. When we think of Indians, we think of mounted Indians, who worked the buffalo. But our Indians were hunters and gatherers. They didn't practice agriculture because they didn't really need to. The population was small. They managed wide swaths of land through a kind of a pyro management. And so that's when the Europeans first came here. Portola, who was the governor of Spanish California. In those days, the governor needed to be much more of a buccaneer. You needed to have a lot of different skill sets. He was sent to come up to California to try to decide where they could put some missions, because Spain was worried that it was going to be losing its grip on empire. So he was lost. He and his group had gone up, and they were trying to find the San Francisco Bay. They couldn't find it. It was foggy. They ran out of food. They were getting sick, and they wandered back through, and in this very Arroyo Seco, they ran into Chief Hahamongna and his tribelet, who helped him, who gave him, acorns, and they, from the earliest journals of the Europeans, they say the place is like a park. And they, of course, were connecting it to their own biblical images of Eden. But the reason it looked like a park is that the Native Americans did manage the land. They burned 5 to 10% of the land every year. because then it would be the following year, it would become fertile, and they would grow, chia seeds and the various things. They knew the plants here. They knew all sorts of medicines. They were a basket culture, and when you think about it, baskets are better than pots because if you drop them, they don't break. So they were a highly developed, hunting-gathering culture. They had different clans, and this land was extremely important to them. This was their home, and it changed very radically after 1769 when the Spaniards came. But I think we should, take interest and pride in the local Indians, and that they were, their language was lost. They were probably, the Gabrielino were kind of a laid-back group. They were sometimes described as even more peaceful than the Chumash. The Chumash were not a warlike tribe. So they used the land, they lived here, and they enjoyed it, and we all know the tragedy of the Native Americans, but in this place it's a little bit worse, even because when Pasadena came, they thought, well, let's find an Indian name, and they didn't. The language was so lost that they ended up using a Chippewa term, which came from Indians that were actually like in the Midwest, because they didn't know any of the native language. So I just hope as you continue on your walkabout that you will just try to imagine, what it was like when this land was being used by these Indians who knew how to use it, and they had very productive lives here. Acorns have a really high in fat. They're high in protein. This was just one of several acorn cultures that existed all around the world, in China and in Europe. So hunter-gatherers only spend about 4 hours a day getting whatever they need to live. And whereas if you have an agricultural lifestyle, you work much longer hours. So I don't think whenever you hear it, that somehow that our Indians were anything less just because we didn't, have horses and hunt buffaloes. As soon as the Spaniards brought horses, the Gabrielino became incredible horse people. But the horses all came from Europe, so the Spaniards didn't really reach California to try to colonize it until the late 18th century. So with that question,
when was the last time that people lived here, sort of outdoors in the wild?
Well, they were living here when the Spaniards came, which was the San Gabriel Mission was established 1771. So they were here, and you have to remember that not all Indians became missionized Indians. But because of there was forced labor. The Spaniards did enslave the Indians. Once you became baptized, you were not free to leave. And they also, every mission had right next to it a fort. And so the Awas would have the military there who would gather the necessary labor. And they would also really interfere with the economy of the Indians. They would block the trade routes. So there was a pretty aggressive move when you realize how many missions were built in a really short period of time, and how few, padres were here. In the whole Spanish period, there were maybe 1,000 Spaniards. So they had soldiers of mixed mestizo blood, and they really had Indian labor. And that's how they built, 26 missions in a few years. Yes?
Over the period of time that the hunter-gatherers were here, how early do we think?
Well, from about 8,000 years ago, there's been dated human habitation here. But the people who were here 8,000 years ago were probably not the Gabrielino. They actually came from the Great Basin, further, northeast. And when the Great Basin began to dry out, the group that became the Gabrielino came in to what was Chumash territory. And you can tell from the languages that they sort of divided it. So there was the they were Udo Aztecan, and that's a different language group than the Chumash, which is just to the north and just to the south. Also, they have so they kind of just split the existing. But there was a lot of movement of people.
The Dust Bowl of Indians.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Did they come
so
on
there was,
66?
yeah.
Do we know when they found it?
Well, yeah, it started. That started like around, I think 5,000 years ago. But there were people who were here dating from 8,000. But those were not the people. Those were not the Gabrielino. There were a different group that got kind of displaced by them. So, you know, there's a really interesting project of those who are interested. Stephen Hackle is a project at the Huntington where they're going over all of the records. The Spanish were incredible record keepers, and the Mission San Gabriel, and this would have been within their territory. They controlled a few million acres of land. Was the most productive mission in all of California. And they, you know, so this is by, you know, saying exactly how many bushels of this, how many, you know, of that, how many workers. And unfortunately, the lifespan of Indians who joined the mission was really short. You know, the infant mortality was like, you know, 80%. It was a pretty sad tale. But I know you want to probably get on your walkabout if you have any more questions, but otherwise I would say go on to the next station.
Thank you.
Thank you.